26, the interwar years. So this is we're gonna spend a few extra days on this chapter. Um, I think it's a pretty important chapter. Definitely, um, a lot of political change, I would say, in Asia. Um, Economic changes in obviously the United States during the world, and also how people responded. So after World War One, it was a sense of bewilderment. People were struggling economically, um, psychologically, and um, as a result of that, we see some radical change politically. Even the literature, we talked about the lost generation emerges, right? Pablo Picasso is a great example of that as an artist who captures this bewilderment. People were losing faith in reason and progress. Again, you know, that's how authoritarian governments really reacted, right? It's the end of the Enlightenment in a sense, at least temporarily, with those Enlightenment ideals. We're going to see more government intervention in the economy. Um, Liberalism is fading away, the traditional liberalism. We're going to see a move towards more socialist um, societies. Um, Also, it was an opportunity. People, or colonized people, saw it as an opportunity, right? Many had fought in World War One, were hoping for more freedom, didn't get it. So we're going to see those movements grow, especially in India and Africa. And again, we're going to see kind of some new ideals artistically emerging. All right, so the Great Depression is really the first major economic change that we're going to see. So that's going to kind of emerge in 1929. We've studied it in U.S. history too. It's not going to end until the early part of World War II. Um, Germany struggled the most, no doubt. The Great Depression kind of begins in the United States, but Germany was really already struggling. All of the European countries were struggling. Remember, their economies were devastated. Their countries were devastated. And Germany was really forced to bear that brunt. And they couldn't pay their debts. They struggled to pay reparation payments that the Treaty of Versailles required. So to kind of counter that, the government of Germany printed more money. And that's never good. That's going to lead to lots of inflation. Um, France and England couldn't pay back U.S. loans. That's going to hurt our economy. Our banks are going to wither away as a result of that. So you could actually argue that the European, they weren't able to buy a lot of our goods, obviously. So the European struggles definitely contributed to our economic downturn. Our economic downturn, kind of the spark was the stock market crash in 1929, and that's going to lead to massive bank failures. Um, it's called the Great Depression because unemployment was at 30%. Just for comparison, the Great Recession in 2008 was like 10%, and it was considered the second worst economic decline. Today it's at 3.8%, just again for comparison. So 30% is astounding. Hopefully we never get there again. Um, U.S. investors were pulling their capital out of Europe again. Banks were failing because Europeans weren't paying back their loans. But overall, I would say Germany got hit the hardest, and that's important context. The rise of Hitler. They were struggling that much that they were willing to listen to a fascist, totalitarian ruler like Hitler. And obviously, Asia and African nations felt the effects. Japan actually was fairly isolated, and they actually recovered pretty easily from the Great Depression in this period, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Um, by 1932, there were 30 million people out of work. That's incredible. And again, Japan actually came out of it quickly, mostly because they devalued their currency. We don't see that a lot. China does that a bit today. They basically, and I'm not sure how it happens, but the price of the yen became much less than the price of the dollar, for example. So their products became less expensive. So if you're Germany or if you're France and you're looking for a car, right, or some product to buy, you might buy their products as opposed to American cars because the Japanese cars were cheaper. Um, that's one way that China has kind of gained over the last 30 years. They've devalued their currency. So Chinese products are much cheaper for Americans or for Europeans. And as their economy improved, they were able to invest more in militarization, right? So remember, it goes back to the Meiji reign. They started to industrialize, right? Slowly but surely. By the 1930s, their industry is really very competitive with the rest of the world, and they're making bullets and they're making planes and they're making guns, and that's going to contribute to their ability to expand, which ultimately leads to World War II. So the devaluing of their currency is an important little concept. How they manipulate their economy. Again, not free market economy, that's for sure. That's the government getting in there, and not hands off, that's for sure. All right, so Franklin Roosevelt in Congress proposed a New Deal. We've studied it, and it's an example of Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian actually. John Maynard Keynes was a philosopher. He was not Adam Smith in a sense. He believed that there were times where we had to take a hands-on approach, or the government had to take a hands-on approach, and that meant the government had to spend a lot of money. They did have to cut taxes, especially on the working Americans, and they did have to borrow from other countries or encourage lending from Americans in the form of bonds, for example. So the bottom line is, to get people to work, you had to spend some money, and that's what the New Deal did, right? The New Deal created jobs. If you recall, the WPA, the Workers Progress Administration, where our government paid unemployed Americans to build bridges and schools and boardwalks. If you go to the Jersey Shore, a lot of those boardwalks were built during the Great Depression. And that the idea of Keynesian economics is, if you spend money, you borrow and then spend, that'll create jobs, and Americans will spend that money, and the money will be put back into the economy. It's the opposite of something called trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics would be cut taxes on the rich, cut taxes on corporations, and they'll invest that surplus by hiring more. A lot of people don't believe that that's an effective strategy. Some people believe that in a time of crisis that you need to engage in deficit spending. So two very different economic philosophies. And again, the New Deal is a great symbol of Keynesian economics. During the 2008 recession, we did a lot of that. The government under the Bush administration and then the Obama administration spent money to get people back to work. Not on the scale of the New Deal, but it's the same philosophy. So basically, we call it the three R's. The New Deal created jobs, especially in construction. Reform. It basically reformed the banking industry to avert bank closures. Today, your money is insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation up to $200,000. So if banks close and you have $150,000 in the bank, it is insured and you will get that money. They also reformed the stock market. The Security and Exchange Commission was created to monitor the sale of stocks and other investments. And then relief. Relief would be to provide aid to those who are unemployed or unable to work in the form of welfare, right? That was the birth of Social Security. Unemployment insurance, right? And obviously welfare payments, people who, again, are unable to work or who are looking for a job, right? Or that's unemployment, but people who can't work, for example. All right, so in Europe, we see the emergence of right-wing governments. One reason why, Roosevelt went a little socialist was because he feared a revolution. He feared that, well, what happened in Germany, what happened in Russia, what happened in Italy, what happened in Mexico, what happened in the United States, where the working poor would get so frustrated they would overthrow the democratic government and replace the democratic government with a totalitarian ruler who promised jobs. And that's basically what happened in Europe. So fascism emerges. And fascism is another term. It's not like Marxism. In fact, it's very different than Marxism. Fascism is, and we hear that term today, actually. That's scary. We do hear that term today. But it's this idea of extreme nationalism, where you give up some of your freedoms for the good of the nation, right? Someone like Hitler was able to play on that nationalism and use that nationalism to unite the people under his rule, in a sense. It glorified the military, right? People were were proud of their growing militaries and proud of expansionism and proud of military takeovers. Again, it helped unify the country. And a really common denominator with fascist governments, including Italy and the Soviet, and Hitler, Germany, they blame their problems on ethnic minorities, and that's the scariest part, right? We see that today, the rise of fascism in a sense, where people are struggling maybe economically, or they're concerned about their culture fading away, and they blame their problems on ethnic minorities. And so, in return for perhaps glory and prosperity, you give up some of your rights. Freedom of speech, for example, freedom of the press was limited. Hitler burned books. He had secret police that would spy on those who went against him. So again, that's the dark side of fascism. And in many cases, the government justified violence against those minorities or against those people who went against the nation, right? So again, a key word is extreme nationalism, glorification of the military, again, the blaming of problems and the suppressing of political opposition. And in a fascist government emerges a totalitarian ruler who controls all aspects of society, including the economy. Now, in Nazi Germany, there was private ownership, but those private owners were really at the beck and call of Hitler in a sense, where they were indebted to him. They were loyal to him. So they might have profited personally or privately, but they definitely had to show loyalty to Hitler. All right, fascism also rose up in Italy. Benito Mussolini was the dictator who rose to power. He believed in an ideology called corporatism. I didn't spell that correctly. And basically, it's this idea that economically you have three groups. You have the employers, the trade unions, or the workers, and the state officials. And they're separate, but they work together, right, to support the nation. And they can operate freely as long as, again, it supports the whole nation. So it's not socialism, but the idea is it's these entities work together in concert. Yes, there's going to be private ownership, and the employers might benefit from that, but the workers are going to gain as well, and the government's going to make sure of that in a sense. So no one really takes advantage of the economy. Italy or Mussolini was a totalitarian ruler. Like Hitler, he controlled all aspects of society. Limited freedoms, had secret police that took out opponents. It was a pretty brutal dictator in a sense. But again, Italy was a fascist government or a fascist nation where he appealed to people's hatred of outsiders and a lot of resentment after World War I as well. They didn't receive a lot of territory. And that created some frustration. Their economy was struggling as well, and Mussolini was able to rise to power using propaganda. That's another characteristic of a fascist nation, where they use propaganda to attack their opponents and attack those ethnic minorities. Also, expansionism, another key factor here. Germany did the same thing. They went after inferior nations. It was like a modern-day scramble for Africa. Hitler went after Egypt and other parts of northern Africa. Italy went after Libya and colonized Somalia on the eastern coast of Africa. He both defied the League of Nations. That was the problem. The League of Nations that was set up after World War I was ineffective. They weren't able to stop this growing expansionism. And by 1936, Mussolini had formed an alliance with Hitler and then invades Albania, which is an Eastern European country. So another characteristic would be this military expansionism of fascist nations. So Nazism. So the Nazis were a political party. However, Hitler practiced fascism. So in a sense, you're going to combine socialism with fascism. So Germany, for all intents and purposes, was a socialist nation, not communist. In fact, Hitler was very critical of communists. The idea of a violent overthrow and the workers controlling all aspects of the economy. He did allow for some private ownership. The government only controlled the modes, the means of production, right? The mines, the important factors. So the Nationalist Social German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, emerges. So prior to Hitler's rise to power, Germany was actually a democracy after World War One. The the empire was broken up, and the Weimar Republic emerges with a democratic leader. But it was ineffective and weak. The people were frustrated with the economic chaos. People were resentful of how Europe treated Germany. So there's this kind of this anger, and people were looking for a leader who would return Germany to its glory, and that's what happened. Hitler and the Nazis kind of instill fear and panic. They blame minorities. They blame supporters of the Weimar Republic. They blame all those European nations that punished them. A great example of fear is that they actually staged a fire on a parliament building known as the Reichstag building, and they actually blamed the communists. So Germany did have a communist party emerging, but Hitler kind of started to target them, and that allowed, again, that was another enemy, the Communist Party. And eventually Hitler was elected to power. Interestingly enough, he was elected to power. Once in power, he bans political parties, he eliminates opponents, and he promotes something called scientific racism, a little bit of social Darwinism tied into that. And basically, it's this idea of racial superiority, and he targeted Jews. Not just Jews, there were other groups he targeted as well. That is known as anti-Semitism, which would be, again, targeting Jews or believing that Jews were inferior. Now, he didn't just go after Jews. They went after homosexuals, people who were disabled, gypsies, who were ethnic minorities in Germany. Some of the processes to discriminate, he didn't put Jews in concentration camps right away. It started in 1935 with the Nuremberg laws, which actually discriminated against Jews, prevented them from owning certain property, just more of almost like Jim Crow laws. Then you have Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass in 1938. It was a riot against Jews, more of a symbol of the growing hatred. That's when we start to see the birth of concentration camps. Eventually, we know that millions of Jews would be gassed to death, executed in these death camps. But it begins in the late 1930s where Jews were put to these workers' camps. Eventually, they were also segregated or put into ghettos or cities in Europe, where they were kind of, that was kind of one of the stages or steps. And then there was Lebensraum. It was this policy of living space, growing the boundaries of Germany to help alleviate the population growth. So we'll spend a little more time on the Holocaust after the exam. But be able to identify some of these discriminatory acts or laws, right? All right, so let's move to Spain. There was actually a civil war in Spain. In 1936, Francisco Franco emerges. He was a nationalist, and again, that's not a term that is synonymous with democracy. So at the time, Spain was actually also kind of a republic. The loyalists were more democratic, more traditional, and it's not traditional, but they wanted, a republic born where the people would obviously elect leaders. So Franco emerges again. The people are unhappy. The depression is hurting the people of Spain. So Franco emerges as a nationalist leader, a dictator in a sense, and he obviously, no surprise, gets help from Hitler and Mussolini. And he rules actually as a military dictator until 1975. That's a long time. So democracy kind of falls apart in 1936. All right, Brazil. This is the last slide. So there's also there's a political revolution in Brazil. So it's a great symbol of the rise of conservatism. Remember, conservatism is maybe coming back a little bit. Government interventionism, absolutism in a sense. Only Hitler and Franco weren't necessarily, aristocratic, kings. But they were dictators. So this happens in Brazil as well. But the working class was frustrated. They too resented the landowning class. This is going to happen in Mexico as well. The Great Depression fueled that resentment. So basically, again, there's this frustration over perhaps the government's ineffectiveness, and that's going to lead to, again, more government intervention. So basically, Leo Vargas seizes power in 1930. He takes over the more moderate government in a coup. Vargas is pro-industry, so he is going to, grow that a little bit. Even though Brazil for centuries was really an agrarian economy, sugar plantations. But in return for maybe growing economic progress, he's going to take away people's individual freedoms. He's going to censor the press like Mussolini did. He's going to go after political rivals and ban political parties like Hitler did. So a common theme here, right? Whether it was Hitler, Italy, Franco in Spain, or Vargas in Brazil, we're going to see the rise of authoritarian or totalitarian dictators, right? Definitely more of a conservatism growing. The days of liberalism were kind of fading away. Again, remember, that's different from how we see conservatism today, right? But that's going to be a major change in Brazil. So keep that in your memory bank. Vargas was not a fascist by definition, but mostly because he didn't rely on violence. Maybe fear, intimidation, but he didn't execute his rivals per se. So that's the big difference, right? Remember, under fascism, there is going to be a violent phase too. Actually, Brazil, even though Vargas was an authoritarian ruler, he did support the U.S. We kind of took on all comers. If it meant, taking on an ally that maybe wasn't democratic in nature, it was okay because they were going to help us defeat Nazi Germany. But afterwards, the people of Brazil would call for democratic reforms, right? How could you fight for freedom or fight for democracy abroad and not support that at home? They believed that Vargas, although he improved the economy, a dictatorship went against those ideals that were being fought for during World War II. We were going after a dictatorship. All right, that's it, guys. We're going to do political revolutions tomorrow.